If you make a list of the elements you'd expect to find in an aeroplane, things like wings, tail, fuselage, you'll find that at some stage of aviation's history, some designer has done away with each of them. Some makes of aircraft have not had wheels, others have lacked fuselage and tail. The variety of shapes that have appeared at one time or another as aeroplanes is staggering. Yet, for each of them, there was a design idea that logically directed the outcome. Admittedly, some of the premises on which various shapes were based were either wrong or simply perverse, and some indeed look, if not insane, then certainly bizarre. We have our conception of what looks normal in an aeroplane. Yet, today's conception bears little to no relation to the first flying machines, and probably will bear only limited similarity to the leading edge of future aircraft design. It is, however, also true to observe that designers often pursue ideas that are ahead of their time, and that there are many instances, like the flying wing, where one era's designs had to await another era's technology or need to be proceeded with. When aviation began, it was not so much a matter of questionable data. There was no real understanding of what made flight possible. There were some ideas available that observably worked, but the essence of how they worked would not in fact be answered for many years. Hence, much common sense was wasted in following assumptions that were based on wrong interpretations of why some flying machines did work. In today's sense, there was no scientific basis to the avenues explored by designers. They tended to follow engineering ideas and mechanical advances, operating on a combination of intuition and experience that often led them astray, sometimes fatally. Quite often, their results looked downright comic to our eyes, though presumably, at the time, the designs that worked looked no less unlikely than those that didn't. By the 1940s, the variety of shapes considered were, in the main, based around configurations that we would recognize clearly as capable of flight, although still there was a certain amount of hopeful supposition about some elements. Here, Alexander Savesky, who founded what was to become the Republic Corporation, shows a model of his pet project for a long-range passenger seaplane. With its huge retractable pontoons and accommodation within the wings, the plane displays an attachment to past certainties, harking back to the flying boats. But it also exhibits quite modern considerations of drag, and one suspects, had it been built, it would have been fairly successful in meeting its design objectives. At the time, it represented the informed view of an aviation expert on what the future of the aeroplane would be. Today's designer looks to the future with the aid of sound scientific information and the huge capability of computers to study and assess his propositions. The shapes he looks at in his considerations of future demand can be extensively tested without being built, and those that will be built will have already been refined to extreme tolerances, with little to no uncertainty about their ability to perform. The restrictions he has to conform to relate to the complexity of the aeroplane and the cost of its construction. The shape of a plane is, of course, largely dictated by its function, and enough is known to suggest a shape once the parameters of the job a plane is to do are defined. For much of aviation's history, however, trial and error has been the order of the day. The Wright brothers' plane was configured with the propeller behind the wing, with the blades pushing the plane through the air. This arrangement recurred throughout the piston-engined era, with several notable and successful aircraft being pushers. The Japanese Shinden, or Magnificent Lightning, of World War II was not only a pusher, but employed canard winglets in a tail-first arrangement that's reappeared in very modern fighters of today. Although orders for the plane were placed, it never made it into production. During World War II, the US Air Force experimented with several advanced pusher-propped piston-engined fighters. One of the adventurous designs was the Northrop XP-56, a plane that showed its lineage in its tailless design, complex control systems and swept-back wing. It was originally designed without a dorsal fin, but one was added before its first flight on the 6th of September 1943. The plane used contra-rotating propellers spinning behind the fins. The first example crashed due to undercarriage failure, and the plane was a total write-off. The pilot, John Myers, though badly injured, survived and recovered to fly again. With its wingtip Venturas, elevons, air-operated bellows rudders and wing root intakes, the XP-56 exhibited the innovation and design daring that was the hallmark of the Northrop Company. Only 2 XP-56s were built, but for such an extreme design, they were quite successful planes. The Germans, meanwhile, were developing the Dornier 335 with propellers at both ends. The plane actually went into series production, but only a few had been delivered to the Luftwaffe by the end of the war. Here, the designer's experimentation with engine placement saw 2 embedded in tandem in the fuselage, one behind the cockpit driving the rear propeller by means of a shaft. 2 versions of the 335 went into production, the single-seat fighter bomber and a 2-seat night fighter. One of the successful pusher concepts, and certainly the biggest, was the B-36 Peacemaker, with its 6 engines positioned along the trailing edge of its huge wing. One of the main reasons for this arrangement was so that the wing's lift was not disrupted by the engine nacelles and the airflow over the wings was not disturbed by the massive turbulence of the propellers. The arrival of the jet engine set a whole new range of problems and options to the designers. Not the least of the considerations they now faced was the limited power of the early jets, which saw the emergence of aircraft like the Junkers 287, which, in addition to its forward-swept wings, employed multiple engines, in this case in a pair on the nose and another pair on the wings. And this still left the Junkers light on for power, and it often employed rocket pods to assist takeoff. The Germans experimented with several large multi-engined jets, and some of their designs have either influenced or mimicked the efforts of post-war designers in other countries. Martin's XB-51 had 2 of its 3 engines slung on pylons under the fuselage, with the 3rd mounted in the tail. The placement of the engines was decided upon to keep the intakes clear of the disturbed air around the plane's fuselage. One reason for such an arrangement. Another reason for an arrangement where the engines sit clear of the fuselage on pylons is best exemplified by the A-10, where the possibility of damage to one engine sending bits of debris into the other is minimized by keeping the engines as far apart as possible, so that hopefully the plane will survive battle damage. The location of the engines of a plane and the number of engines to be used remain variables that designers weigh in developing new aircraft. Even today, new planes appear with shapes that we find odd, like the way that the nearly familiar shape of Boeing's YC-14, suggesting the Hercules and Lockheed's other transports, is disrupted by the positioning of the engines in their barrel-like housings before the wing. This is no accident or whim, but reflects the particular role intended for the plane, with the wings deflecting the engine's thrust to shorten takeoff. The The Heinkel 162, designed in the last desperate months of the war to be rapidly mass-produced by slave labour, simply lumped the engine on top, giving it clean airflow and keeping it away from the wing to avoid disruption of the wing's lift, and perhaps also because such a location was a simple and cheap design option. This location of the engine appeared in other designs for the Luftwaffe and was also suggested much later by the North American company's YF-107, developed from a design study conducted around the F-100 Super Sabre. The F-107 had a large dorsal intake directly behind the pilot's position. The designers surely had their good reasons for adopting the configuration, but the pilots were also justified in their detestation of the idea of being both unable to see behind them and unable to be certain that upon ejecting from the plane, they would not be sucked into the intake or impaled upon it. The 107 flew well and was considered a formidable proposition, but was edged out of selection by the Air Force by the F-105. Only 3 107s were built, and the pilots never got to test the designer's promises that ejection would be safe. With a plane like the F-107, with the jet buried in the fuselage, the disruption to the exterior of the plane is caused by intakes to supply air to the engine. In the past 50 years, jet engines have appeared in almost every possible position in the basic form of an aeroplane that's imaginable. An obvious position was to sling the engine underneath, accepting the drag penalty and simplifying the construction. However, this plane, Messerschmitt's P1101, had another feature that made it the subject of a lot of Allied attention after the war. It employed a variable position wing with 3 fixed positions between 35 and 45 degrees of sweep set before takeoff. From this basis, the engineers at the Bell Corporation, under Robert Woods, developed a practical in-flight variable sweep wing mechanism. The result, complex but functional, was fitted to the company's X-5 experimental plane, the first successful swing-wing aircraft. One side benefit of the X-5 was that the plane had appalling spin characteristics and was difficult to fly. And studies of what was wrong with the design revealed a lot of information about how to interpret wind tunnel data and further contributed significantly to an understanding of what made a plane susceptible to such bad spin behavior. The advantage of a swing wing like the F-111's is that it allows the plane to take advantage of the higher lift provided by a straight wing at lower speeds, and also to sweep the wing back to minimize drag problems at high speed. The designers have incorporated the virtues of both options, avoiding making a choice and limiting the plane's potential. Of course, the variation in approaches to wing shape and placement has been large, and as with the question of engine placement, much theorizing and testing has gone on, and a great variety of shapes has been seen at one time or another. Of course, not only do wings provide lift, they provide drag, turbulence and weak points. Hence, as planes have become faster and the drag and turbulence, as well as the forces operating on the wing, have become greater, attention to the wing shape has heightened. Alexander Lippisch, the German designer of the Delta wing, came to the US after the war and developed the idea for Convair into the XF-92. A Delta wing gives advantages in allowing a thin wing, but one that still contains a lot of storage space. It also provides a large wing area to allow slower takeoff and landing speeds, and shifts the control surfaces well aft of the centre of gravity. To counter the desirable aspects, there is a tendency to inferior spin recovery and a requirement for high-angle takeoff and landing attitude. The XF-92, with its extravagant fin, is an extreme Delta configuration. The B-58 Hustler, another Convair Delta wing, with its dramatic planform, is perhaps one of the most memorable of these designs. It was the Air Force's first supersonic bomber, but was caught by the development of both anti-aircraft and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and was not produced in as large a run as had originally been envisioned. Another approach to the shape of planes was that taken by the McDonnell Company in developing its first aircraft. The company had been making components for other manufacturers, but was determined to strike out in its own right. In the clamour of war, the Air Force was busy with procurement, and production designs were given higher priority in access to materials and funding than were experimental types. The only high-priority prototypes were those for jet-powered and night fighter designs. McDonnell were perhaps lucky, therefore, to get backing for their experimental plane. The company's first design, the XP-67, a twin-engine single-seat monoplane that was known as the Bat, was far from conventional and reflected radical choices in configuration. 2 prototypes were ordered in October 1941, but the first wasn't to fly until January 1944. The laminar flow airfoil sections were maintained throughout the design, with the fuselage and nacelles blended into the large wing surface. This form of long sweeping curves expanding and contracting lent the plane a unique appearance and gave it a very large internal volume while maintaining a small frontal area. The shape contained enough space for large fuel tanks, pressurized cockpit, tricycle undercarriage and 6 37mm cannon. The supercharged engines utilized their exhausts for extra thrust, and the plane employed many experimental or advanced design features. Unfortunately, the engines provided failed to deliver the expected power, and the Bat never was pushed to see how fast its shape could actually go. The laminar flow streamlining of the plane represents an approach to one of the persisting and intractable problems of aerodynamics, what is referred to as boundary layer turbulence. This contributes about 80% of the friction drag created by a plane, with that friction drag representing approximately half of all drag working against an aircraft. The boundary layer is the very thin layer of air next to the surface of an aircraft in flight. When the flow of this air is uniform, that is when the particles move in parallel and don't intermingle, the airflow is said to be laminar. Natural flow of this type is rare. The boundary layer generally breaks up into a turbulent flow as it passes over the wing and fuselage, resulting in a sharp increase in friction drag. The study of laminar flow control was initiated by a number of researchers around the world during the mid-1930s, with most of them approaching the problem from the standpoint of streamlining, believing that a perfect shape could be developed that would ensure clean air around a plane. As they saw it, the idea was to maintain laminar flow by scientifically shaping aerofoils and related aerodynamic bodies, and they achieved considerable success in theoretical pursuit of this aim. However, that success was limited overall in that, with the structures they designed, it was found that the stability of the natural laminar boundary layer profile was too low at high speed to withstand even very small disturbance. A more successful approach has proven to be mechanical intervention, removing the innermost part of the boundary layer with very small amounts of suction through a porous skin. This is, however, too expensive and hard to maintain to be much practical use in production aircraft, and the problem remains. The XP-67, representing perhaps the most extreme example of streamlining, did show favourable wind tunnel results through extensive testing. But ultimately, it was a nice try at something impossible. It must be added that the Bat was not just strange, but in its own way, quite beautiful. After a generally unsatisfactory performance in testing, due in no small part to the limits of the engines, the first XP-67 crashed on September the 6th, 1944, and the second example was cancelled, bringing the career of the Bat to a close. The forward thinking of the blending of fuselage and wings has been one of the faces of aircraft design that has lived on, being refined into some of today's production designs. Perhaps the most famous example is shrouded in secrecy, the redoubtable SR-71, Kelly Johnson's delta-winged Blackbird. Another plane with blended shapes is the variable geometry B-1, which has emerged from its off-and-on development as one of today's most potent military aircraft. Fast, capable of nap-of-the-earth flight, and using a battery of inboard computers. Its sleek lines and advanced avionics combine in a form that is dictated by its mission, Incursion by manned bombers into hostile airspace being so difficult today that the plane's only hope of success in carrying out a mission lies in its stealth and electronic countermeasures abilities. In the realm of fighters, too, the softening of shapes has persisted, with General Dynamics F-16 being a prime example of modern design. Here, the most important aspect of the design is that it's deliberately unstable, having its centre of gravity too far to the rear, and the plane is kept flyable by the constant ministrations of computers. The advantage of this arrangement being in augmented manoeuvrability. Without the computers, the plane would porpoise uncontrollably. With the computers, it's one of the world's top air superiority weapons. The X-3, with its arrowhead lines, showed another approach to high-speed wings, limiting them to the stubby squared fins that were to reappear on the F-104 starfighter. In 1950, another American fighter that drew upon German wartime research made its first flight, the Vought F-7U Cutlass, a carrier fighter for the United States Navy that started another of the design genealogies we can trace to the current day. The Cutlass was an extreme design for its time, a tailless single-seater with two afterburning turbojets and twin rudders midway out on the 38-degree swept-back wing's trailing edge. The wings had an aspect ratio of 3:1 and leading-edge slots. This layout offered advantages for a carrier-based aircraft, for it offered a high rate of climb and top speed, combined with compactness when the plane's squared wings were folded. 290 Cutlasses were built, and they proved to be an extremely strong aircraft with great performance. But they suffered a high attrition from accidents, and their time on the inventory was to be cut short. They stayed in service only 3 years after production stopped in 1955. However, looking at several of today's fighters, we can see echoes of the F-7U's shape. Here, the designers had done away with the conventional tail of an aircraft and its attendant drag and turbulent vortices. The predictable elements of an aeroplane must therefore be seen as options, dictated to by the nature of the task at hand. Planes with no tail offer advantages for some functions, and the Cutlass, like today's F-14, was an excellent carrier-based fighter. At the same time as the Cutlass was going out of service, NASA and the Air Force both began series of tests on another lineage. This time, not only was the tail missing, so were the wings. The functional specifications for this aircraft were completely new. It was to be a flyable orbiter, a spacecraft that could be flown back to a landing after surviving hypersonic speeds and extreme heat in re-entry. The descriptive normally applied to these shapes is lifting bodies. They do, in fact, have a wing-like aerofoil cross-section, but it's the whole fuselage. The shapes avoid having any flat planes to present to friction in re-entry, with their softened belly lines and nose. They were designed to present minimal drag in their long, semi-powered glides. It was planned that they would have their own rocket motors to allow them to maneuver in the Earth's atmosphere and land in a fairly conventional way. The lifting bodies arose out of research conducted by NASA, which was picked up on by the Air Force in considering a project for reusable spacecraft that must be seen as the grandfather of today's space shuttle. NASA's HL-10 and M2F2 were both constructed by Northrop, and both had fairly checkered careers. They proved to be extremely tricky things to fly. They were tested and flown successfully, though of course they never achieved the grander aims of their designers. In the main, because the technology of that era, and indeed still today's technology, could not provide the materials or the avionics to allow such a plane to be successfully built. The lifting bodies were essentially constructed to carry out experiments that would supply a database for the development of related materials and dynamics. At the time, two schools of thought were emerging from the chaos of the early days of space research. One, concerned with ballistic re-entry, argued that an object re-entering from space should be allowed to plunge into the atmosphere directly. The counter idea was that the re-entering body be shaped to allow a somewhat slower, controlled atmospheric penetration, with return to a landing under conventional aerodynamic control. The two schools were poles apart. A lifting re-entry vehicle would be significantly more advanced and technologically far more demanding. It would, of course, also be far more useful. But not only would it have to withstand the stresses of being launched, but it would have to perform in 4 different regimes of flight: space, hypersonic transatmospheric, transonic inside the atmosphere, and subsonic prior to landing. However, the complexity of the task was not as daunting as the potential rewards were alluring. A large number of different configurations for a transatmospheric vehicle had been proposed during the course of the early space program, but few suggested viable solutions to the extraordinary problems of re-entry. The research had led in 1958 to NASA's M2 configuration, a half cone with a rounded nose. Theoretically, such a vehicle would permit reductions in G requirement from 8 to possibly as low as 1. Development work had shown that the plane was barely stable in subsonic flight, and repeated modification was undertaken in arriving at the shape of the M2F2 seen here. After the modifications, the shape exhibited an almost conventional airfoil cross-section. The M2F2 and the HL-10, NASA's 2 test aircraft, went through an extended series of glide tests and powered flight tests, with successful firing of their rocket engines and in-flight controlled maneuvers. Although their handling characteristics were not ideal, they were both flyable and served successfully as test vehicles. The NASA tests on their lifting bodies followed considerable work by scientists and engineers working within NASA's own facilities, developing the basic theories of the aircraft and also constructing and testing a model of the proposition, the M2F1. This was fairly rudimentary, with a fixed undercarriage simply bolted to the bottom of the plywood and tubular steel body, and had been primarily concerned with the practical assessment of the lift generated by the shape and the controllability of such a vehicle. Originally towed behind a car, the model had gone on to being tested as a glider towed behind the NASA C-47. As can be seen from this sequence, the M2F1 shape provided a lot of lifting power as the little aircraft soared above its target takeoff. Earlier, the Air Force had been involved in the Boeing X-20 Dinosaur program and the Martin X-23 tests. These had also been involved in the same problem, the design of reusable, controllable re-entry vehicles, and the X-23 in particular had been a forerunner of the lifting body configuration. The Dinosaur, cancelled in 1963, had never actually progressed beyond the construction of mock-ups. But a lot of the work done in proving technologies and materials to be used in the program was of great value years later, in the development of the Rockwell Space Shuttle. The fat little X-23s, 4 of which were built, were actually launched in 1966 and 67 and pioneered much work in heat shielding and cooling systems that remains valuable.
Roger. Begin a status, final. Go, booster, go. GNC, go. Eagle, go. Go at 40, Capcom.
The Air Force involvement with the X-23 and the Dinosaur was directed at study of flight at high speed outside the atmosphere, and complementary studies of the behaviour of lifting bodies inside the atmosphere in glide and landing tests similar to those with the NASA craft were conducted by the X-24 planes. This was actually the same plane rebuilt. Originally the X-24A, based on research by the Martin Company, the plane was rebuilt as the X-24B, with a totally different appearance, to reflect theoretical studies conducted by the Air Force itself. The X-24 program overall was successful in demonstrating the theoretical advantages of the lifting body shape for the role of reusable piloted spacecraft. And further, they demonstrated reliable controllability beyond that of the earlier NASA models. Overall, the lifting body tests conducted at Edwards during the 1960s laid the groundwork and pointed the way for the development of the first functioning reusable craft, the Space Shuttle. However, they also dispelled some of the wilder hopes in relation to the concept of such space vehicles and spelled out the painful message about the enormous cost and the technological challenge involved in such dreams. In addition, they demonstrated that such craft would be difficult work for the pilot, demanding extreme care and precision. The testing program saw many potentially dangerous situations develop, and it was perhaps partially a matter of luck as much as skill that there were no fatalities during the program. It's probably true to say that no experimental plane's testing can be thought of as free of danger. Wherever the scientists and designers push into the realm of the theoretical or the unknown, there's always the potential for the unforeseen to send things seriously astray. This is probably platitudinous. Certainly it can be accommodated by Murphy's Law without the need to delve into chaos theory. Where the lifting bodies incorporated the aerofoil into the fuselage and did away with the wings, there's long been another school of design that reversed this to make the plane all-wing, doing away with the fuselage and tail. In this case, though here we're looking at the German Horten flying wing of the Second World War, the leading voice and the leading practitioner of the design school was an American. The Horten brothers' work was based upon the vision of a man who pursued the dream of the flying wing from very early on, building his first such aircraft, a balsa model, in 1923. He was to doggedly pursue that dream for 3 decades, convinced that one day the skies would be filled with flying wings. Not a wide-eyed visionary, he was an experienced and successful aviation designer, Jack Northrop, seen here on the left, and he had the knowledge and expertise to see his dream come to fruition, and in fact to build a series of planes to prove his case. However, it was to be a long time before a flying wing was to go into full production. In 1940, Northrop built and flew the N1M as preliminary research to lead up to a large bomber. It was to be followed by a series of variations over the next few years. Next was the N9M, which was a 60-foot model of the bomber to come. But Northrop was also concerned to build flying wings to cover the whole spectrum of military needs, and new planes appeared at regular intervals. To an outsider, there must have been a somewhat obsessive quality about the constant evolution of the types. With the concept so radical, there was plenty of tinkering to do to establish the safest and most controllable configuration and adopt it for use. Along the way, there were to be several notable achievements, including the MX-324, which was the first rocket-powered aircraft to fly in America. The wings appeared to fill every niche, even that of pulse jet-powered flying bomb. But the aim was directed at building big flying wing bombers, and the first of these was the XB-35. The Air Force had ordered 2 prototypes in November 1941 and followed this with a contract for 13 test planes. Wartime plans to build 200 at the Martin Company's Omaha plant were dropped, but the plane proceeded, slowly but surely, towards completion. The first flight came on June the 25th, 1946. The crew consisted of 9 men, and there was accommodation for an additional 6 relief crewmen. The relief were necessary because the plane was designed to be capable of a cruising range of over 10,000 miles. The first 3 flying wings were powered by Pratt & Whitney piston engines, but an order placed on the 1st of June 1945 saw the next 2 planes completed with Allison J-35 jets as XB-49s, and by 1947 the first of these had been rolled out ready for testing. No less than 8 of the engines were installed, fed by intakes in the leading edge. The effect of these fuel-hungry early jet engines on the plane's range was catastrophic, bringing it back to an estimated 4,000 miles if the wing was carrying a reasonable bomb load. This range penalty did, of course, apply to all the early jet bombers. The XB-49 first flew on October the 21st, 1947, and the plane was soon to demonstrate its worth, averaging over 500 miles per hour on some of its extended test flights. It's worth noting that the Air Force at the time was also working with the Convair company on the B-36, the massive 6-piston engine post-war strategic bomber that was to go into full production. This plane, which was to be the Air Force's strategic backbone for the next 10 years, was never to approach 500 miles per hour, even with added jets on later models. However, in late 1947, within the range limitations of the thirsty jets, the XB-49 program was running smoothly, and the Air Force placed orders for more bombers and for a reconnaissance version. The heart of the idea of the wing was that without the drag and turbulence of the fuselage and tail, a plane with a given power plant and fuel storage would be able to carry a comparable load further and faster than a conventional aircraft of similar specifications. And this was to prove to be largely true. The Northrop team were to overcome some very testing problems along the way, but the XB-49 was refined into a fine flying machine. Without the normal control surfaces, some very complex developments had to be made to give the pilot secure command of the craft. But measures of can-do and lateral thinking, coupled with the application of ingenuity and hard theoretical and practical work, gave the wing unique and fully functioning systems. The Air Force retained its doubts about whether the wing was a stable enough platform for bombing, and there were problems fitting the large and unwieldy nuclear weapons of the day into its bomb bay. But the XB-49 program had by 1948 fully verified Jack Northrop's expectations and predictions and looked set for introduction into the Air Force inventory. However, in April 1949, the contracts were cancelled and the planes were scrapped, taking with them Northrop's dream of a world where the sky was filled with economical, efficient flying wings.
Now, a preview of the flying wing transport of tomorrow. The midsection provides ample room for 80 passengers. Spaciousness keynotes the luxurious main lounge, extending 53 feet inside the wing. And future air travelers will really see something. Through the plexiglass windows of the front wing edge, passengers have an unimpaired view of the Earth unrolling thousands of feet below. Coast-to-coast flights in 4 hours may not be too far away. The dorsal tip of the plane provides an excellent vantage point to the world go by. Snug as bugs in their magic carpet, air travelers can look down on mere earthlings as the double quartet of mighty turbojets whistle them through space. The sleek Air Leviathan carries more cargo farther, faster, and with less fuel than any comparable plane. And the bar will raise the spirits of those who don't feel high enough in the stratosphere. The flying wing has the stability of a fine club. The public quickly accepts all the miracles that science provides. Even skyliners like this will become commonplace. But the giant flying wing is more than a super streamlined airplane. It is the fulfillment of scientific vision and symbolizes the practical dreams of science for our world of tomorrow.
When the flying wing reappeared, it was not to be as a luxury liner of the skies, but as something altogether more advanced and dangerous. The stealth bomber, the B-2, built by Northrop's company, took to the air in 1989 after a long and secretive gestation, using developments of the controls of the XB-49 and owing a lot to the work done during that plane's construction and flight testing. Jack Northrop, old and infirm, had been one of very few people not directly involved in the program to be told anything about it. And he died knowing that his vision of the flying wing was to be fulfilled in this strange and menacing new shape. Who knows? The future may yet see flying wings abounding on the world's airways. But for the moment, this is the only flying wing in production. It is also one of the most astonishing triumphs of today's technology. Like the flying wing background of the B-2, the origins of the X-29 go back to work done over 50 years ago. This plane, built by the Grumman Corporation and first flown in December 1984, is in part designed to evaluate the assertions of research which was first presented in a scientific paper in 1935. The true value of that paper on swept wings in relation to forward swept wings has been impossible to test in the interim because of the inadequacies of the available technology. It was not until the development of advanced composites during the 1970s that there existed materials strong enough. Research and development is, like rust, constant. The creation of new materials, new avionics, new radars goes on, sometimes coincidental to potential applications to aircraft design. But with different new tools and materials, the designer can do different things, to current shapes, old shapes, or new shapes. Some of the plans for large hypersonic passenger craft submitted to the X-30 project look suspiciously like very, very large versions of the 1960 lifting bodies. Some look like Flash Gordon artwork, and some simply look like nothing that's ever been thought out loud previously. Behind all of them, there's a fair certainty that they would be able to be built and do the job. If we accept that each new design generation looks strange when it's introduced, then the next generation could strike us as downright weird. Don't hold your breath, perhaps, but keep looking to the skies. There will, we can assume, be more strange planes to come. The X-29 has been designed to explore the advantages and disadvantages of several new technologies and theories. Advanced composites, a close-coupled canard, variable camber, and a thin supercritical airfoil section forward-swept wing. The integration of these state-of-the-art technologies in a single airframe represents a major step forward in aircraft structural and aerodynamic engineering.
Stand by. 10, 9, 8, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right release. Here we go, guys. 70 knots. 80. 90. Everything looks good. Temperature looks good. 150 degrees time. Seconds to go here. 6 degree back. Airborne, 157.
Seen here on its first flight, with Grumman pilot Charles Sewell at the controls, the X-29 provides a glimpse of what a high-performance fighter of tomorrow might look like, and of what it might be able to do. On this and subsequent low-speed test flights, the plane's systems were evaluated and its instrumentation validated.
Like the whole airplane had no discrepancies. As far as I'm concerned, the airplane could be refueled, turned around, and we could go in a few minutes.
The technology tested not only the pilot, but had already tested the people at the Grumman factory in New York, where the plane was built.
Emotional thing to see the airplane fly and come back in the shape that it come back in.
A very high sense of pride.
Then it lifted off and your heart just kind of stops for a while.
We saw the fruits of our labor.
The X-29's construction commenced after an extended series of design studies and thousands of hours of wind tunnel time. The first metal was cut in January 1982, but the plane was not to be rolled out to meet the public eye until 1984. Throughout these years, Program Director Robert Romer and Deputy Program Director Glenn Spate have tackled some very complex and demanding problems, including many never previously encountered. The result is a very different plane indeed.
The X-29 will allow the next generation aircraft to cruise efficiently, both in subsonic flight as current fighters do, but for the first time to cruise efficiently supersonically. And that means an airplane that can get to the fight quicker and get there safer, deliver its weapons, and get back out again without being vulnerable to enemy fire.
The X-29 is controlled by a triple redundant system of computers, and the pilot's commands are assessed by the computers before being put into action. This is, of course, to protect the plane and pilot from decisions that would place the aircraft out of control. Though the wings are constructed of advanced composites, the rest of the aircraft is mostly of conventional all-aluminium construction, with steel utilized in high structural load areas. The X-29s also use several major assemblies that are, in fact, used parts. The forward sections of the planes are from old Northrop X-5 fighters, and several other components, including the main undercarriage, come from F-16s. In addition to its radical wings, the X-29 also employs variable incidence canard to provide pitch trim and control moments, since this allows positive lift to trim and acts as a slat to protect the normally heavily loaded inboard section of the wing. The canard can also be unloaded at high angles of attack to prevent any hung stall or pitch-out tendencies. From its first flight in December 1984, the X-29 has been engaged in a series of test flights that have been outstandingly successful. Given that it's serving to explore many new technological areas at once, the test series was complex and busy. As the plane went through its paces over Edwards Air Force Base, its activity was monitored not only by the installations at the base, but information was relayed by satellite back to Grumman in New York. There, each step in the series was finally assessed.
A data evaluation on receipt of the data in the station here, and within a half a minute to a minute, the determination is made that the maneuver is good and that we can advise the pilot to go on and start the next maneuver.
At the rollout ceremony, then Vice President George Bush inspected the plane and was obviously impressed.
That's a beautiful model, but they got the wing on backwards.
The X-29 represents an important step in the rebuilding of an American defense second to none.
Grumman built 2 X-29s, and they were then carefully packed and shipped to California via the Panama Canal. When they left the factory, they left behind the workers who had given so much to the project.
What you do reflects upon Grumman and yourself as an individual. It's really pride of workmanship.
It was really something else. It was really fantastic.
The biggest thing that I've ever worked on in my life in aircraft.
Just the engineering in it is fabulous, I think.
The biggest thrill was to see it fly.
The high opinions of the Grumman workers were shared by the test pilots.
I think the thing that impresses me about the airplane is the talent that has gone in it, the thoroughness, and the performance of the airplane to date indicates that people, that not only did they work hard, but they knew what they were doing.
It is symbolic that the plane is in part a composite of other aircraft, that it physically owes a lot to the designs that have preceded it. For it is also the result of a combination of theoretical advances that have informed one another and been brought together. It is also symbolic of the predictable fact that the X-29 will add to the pool of information that informs a designer when he sets out to form a new aircraft. The X-29 is, of course, not the only advanced fighter design being tested, and there's no guarantee that there will be planes of the future that employ the forward sweep of its wing. However, there's no doubting that it's making significant contribution to the shape of those planes to come and to the controls and avionics that will be integrated into future fighters.